we started this talk by pointing out that for many people, even when there's a lot of interest, a lot of attraction to practicing this way and exploring this whole realm and the possibilities of sensing with soul, imagining, perceiving, even when one has been practicing that way in those ways for a while, there can still be a kind of force or pull of the sort of culturally dominant view that is entrenched in many respects, in some way or another, entrenched in our psyche and exerting its influence, its kind of stern judgment on what we might be thinking or how we might be practicing, sometimes in very quiet and subtle ways. And so that it may be, for many people, that the practice of sensing with soul and that whole orientation, opening, needs some support in terms of an intellectual exploration or exploration of ideas and concepts that might be inhibiting it, preventing it, judging it, dismissing it, and being aware of those, looking at them, questioning them, and seeing are there other possible ideas that can give this opening and this kind of opening of direction a legitimacy, a support, a grounding, and so that we can feel space in which to explore. That can we pry open the space by considering the influence of ideas and questioning those ideas and finding ideas that will open up the space, that will provide a ground, a legitimization, etc. for sensing with soul and all the possibilities that brings. And we were saying that as part of that, we are heirs to a complex and confusing legacy of ideas coming to us through the culture, through history, and, as I said, it's kind of forming something of a sort of bedrock in the psyche for us. So, in recognizing that fact, recognizing and being aware of what exactly are those ideas, where do they come from, what influence do they have, in beginning, as I said, to question them, to poke a little at that bedrock and the rocks that make up that bedrock, so that they are imprisonment is not happening automatically and unconsciously, so those ideas don't just automatically, unconsciously, or without our consciousness imprison us. And perhaps we can then, if you like, turn the soil, to use a different metaphor, of the ground, made up of these clumps of ideas and rocks and soil, and perhaps in looking at it and working that soil we can turn it and it becomes a different ground, a ground that the soil now turned actually supports a fertility there, fecundity of this, of imagining, perceiving and sensing with soul. It might be at some point for some of you that this very questioning and consideration of ideas and playing in the realm of ideas as they relate to or inhibit or support or open this whole opening of practice that we're talking about, it may be that kind of play and engagement is itself actually soul-making, or becomes at some point soul-making. And also one's sense of being at a certain place in a certain culture with certain needs and certain perspectives and certain dominant trends, etc. And that, so one's whole participation in the culture and the kind of evolution or contest or conversation of worldviews within a culture as it moves forward in time, that whole vision and sense of one's own engagement with different ideas, it becomes soul-making. So that's a possibility too. And so in the first part of the talk yesterday, we looked at some of the threads that we can identify within the legacy from basically from the scientific revolution and the sort of classical scientific worldview kind of overstepping its boundary into scientism, and the overstepping of the epistemological view there, and the what William James called the vicious abstractionism, and several other aspects, and how that actually comes into our life and gives rise to doubt or inhibition or hesitation, or downright forbids certain orientations in practice, certain directions, certain disvalues, certain devalues certain perceptions, experiences, openings, etc., and aspects of our being. And so, alongside the scientific, or as well as the scientific, we can consider a little bit about the Western philosophical legacy, again, that we inherit, which is a complex and rich kind of interweaving of different philosophical traditions as well, alongside the scientific, and in dialogue, in fact, with science. And what I'd also like to try to weave in and include for our consideration in all this are some of the attempts within Western philosophy to open up and question the established and taken for granted epistemologies, ontologies, and worldviews, etc., that were kind of established and then became entrenched with the Western Enlightenment, and kind of shaped what some would call kind of modernist, the modernist worldview. And so there were these attempts to open those ideas up, open those worldviews up, question them, question again, challenge the kind of almost utter domination of scientific thinking. But look also, as I mentioned some of these and draw attention to them, look also at how they often fall short of what we might need and be helped by in opening up and grounding our work, and how some of those attempts in Western philosophy are actually fall short because they're still, I don't know what to say, infected somehow, or still influenced, oftentimes unwittingly, by some of the limited thinking that they sought to break free of. So hopefully we can look at some of that and weave that in and consider where they might be expanded or added to, or themselves challenged and opened up in different ways. And where I'd like to pick that long story up is actually in the early 20th century. And there was this evolution of science that I talked about, and there was the First World War and the Second World War, and a lot, obviously, concern about values and morals and where on earth is humanity going. And several people pointed out the kind of divorce or disconnection between scientific exploration on the one hand and just the whole kind of human context that it happens in, on the other hand, and the consideration of values, moral values and other values. So science tells us nothing about value, certainly not moral values. Husserl, German philosopher Husserl, Edmund Husserl, wrote a book actually called The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, and other pieces, and he was living in Germany after the Nazis rose to power, seized power, actually were elected. And that was part of his concern, but was pointing to science and, in his words, the positivistic reduction of the idea of science to mere factual science. Positivistic means basically the idea that if it's not material and you can't measure it, it's nonsense, in a nutshell. And so that idea of positivism really started to take over in certain philosophical lineages, and more widely in sociology, and as a kind of life view as well. And Husserl points out that positivistic reduction of the idea of science to mere factual science means that, as I said, science has nothing to do with human values, or this question of what human freedom is, etc. It then, I'm quoting now, it excludes in principle precisely the questions which humanity, let's say, excludes in principle science, and this kind of scientific investigation, when it's then transferred to other realms like sociology and philosophy and the human sciences, excludes in principle precisely the questions which humanity, given over in our unhappy times to the most portentous upheavals. He was writing at the time, as I said, the Nazis had come into power in Germany. Can we not say something similar in our time? Excludes in principle precisely the questions which humanity, given over in our unhappy times the most portentous upheavals, finds the most burning. The questions which humanity finds the most burning, questions of the meaning or meaninglessness of the whole of this human existence. So that was part of his concern. This kind of way of thinking that had forgotten about the human, or devalued the human context as something material and measurable, akin to science, was using the classical methodology of classical science to the human sciences, the study of humanity, and then had nothing to say about value and human life, very, very little. So one of the things Husserl did was to respond by focusing on what he called the life world, life-world, and he said this is. I'm actually paraphrasing now from a book that some of you, if you're kind of a little bit interested in these ideas but don't want to go whole hog into sort of reading volumes, there's a really, I think, really nice sort of introduction to a lot of these philosophical ideas in a book by a guy called David West, and it's called Continental Philosophy, and I think it's really good. It's not too long, and you can sort of dip in and out of it, and if you get kind of the bug with these kind of ideas, and as I said earlier, it might be an interesting book for some of you. So I'm paraphrasing a little bit what he said here in that book, and so Husserl responds to this kind of crisis partly with this idea of the life world, and he wants to explore the life world. And what's the life world? Well, it's basically our sense of life as we live it, and also that's a kind of context, this life world, like the ordinary presumption of I exist and you exist separate from me, and I'm in my house right now or whatever, and the table's in front of me, and just the conventional kind of view of the world. That this is the context and the sort of basic presupposition of all thought and action. So it's almost like giving a context to science and philosophy, and understanding them as practices which take place in the life world, and which are given a certain power through the life world, through our culture, through the social networks, but also through this just what Husserl called an unquestioned ground of presuppositions. It's really important. Unquestioned ground of presuppositions. A background of unreflective assumptions, values, and practices. So there's a lot kind of going on there. Assumptions, values, and practices which make up the life world. And so in all scientific inquiry, philosophical inquiry, etc., Husserl says the everyday surrounding world of life is presupposed as existing. The surrounding world in which all of us, even I who am now philosophizing, consciously have our existence. Here also the sciences as cultural facts in this world with their scientists and theories. In this world we are objects among objects in the sense of the life world, namely as being here and there in the plain certainty of experience, before anything that is established scientifically, whether in physiology, psychology, or sociology. On the other hand, we are subjects for this world, namely as the ego subjects, experiencing it, contemplating it, valuing it, related to it purposefully. There's a lot in that. It's quite a dense quote, but one piece there I'd like to highlight is the emphasis on the life world, and then his philosophy then emphasized or limited itself to the investigation of the appearances of the life world. So there was again this kind of, let's stay with appearances. The appearances of life as we experience it. Everyday life that we take for granted, containing all these unreflective presuppositions, assumptions, etc. And it wasn't a new word, or a new kind of philosophical direction, but in a way he kind of gave birth to or started the phenomenological movement, although Hegel and Kant had used this word before. But the phenomenology as the study of the limiting of philosophical investigation to the appearances that are part of our everyday life, inner and outer. And so this phenomenological movement was born in philosophy, staying with the appearances of the life world. Now, you can hear, if not the language, at least some of the tenor of that. You can hear that in a lot of our current explorations of Buddhist practice or insight meditation or mindfulness. People will use slightly different kind of emphases there, but there is also in this kind of Dharma, there's the emphasis on attention to and investigation of the appearances of everyday life, the appearances of our lives. And so can we bring attention to that with mindfulness? Can we bring a bare attention to that? So these are common kind of tropes in the sort of contemporary Western, not just Western, but contemporary Dharma sort of teaching. But again here, even though science started with let's give attention to the appearances, again in both the presuppositions that exist there and also the kind of ways those practices develop to bring new appearances as I'm investigating appearances. It moves out of the life world. In other words, we start with appearances, but either we're approaching with a certain network of ideas that become, as I said, concepts that influence the way of looking, and thus what is experience, as I'll come back to shortly. Or we're just saying, give a really close, bare attention to my experience of the world and my inner experience right now, the life world, if we call it that. Give a really close mindfulness to that. And what happens is the attention kind of starts to deconstruct one's everyday life world experience. And then, again, as I mentioned before, there's a kind of reductionist paradigm, or deconstructionist and then reductionist paradigm operating. You see, when I look closely, this is what I find. That must be reality. These atomic units of perception, sensation, vedana, consciousness, etc. And so sometimes this kind of what we might call a phenomenological intention actually in mindfulness and in bare attention, it's actually again pushes, opens up the sense of the range of what the life world is, and then sometimes declares what it experiences through a certain lens as a kind of reality. But let's stay with the Western philosophy a little bit. We'll come back to Dharma shortly. So, an Italian philosopher called Gianni Vattimo points out, and what I really want to highlight here. So Husserl, with his idea, let's just bring it back to this basic sense of existence and the basic experience we have of life, world, inner, outer, and all that we take for granted in there, wrapped up in that experience. But so really good idea. Problems with it, though. Quite a few problems with it. One is, as I'm quoting Gianni Vattimo now, there is no, and then he puts it in inverted commas, phenomenological analysis of experience. So this is what Husserl wanted to do, a phenomenological analysis and description, investigation of experience. But Vattimo points out, he's a much more recent philosopher, there is no phenomenological analysis of experience, and then he writes, the inverted commas cannot be avoided here. So he's put phenomenological in inverted commas. There is no phenomenological analysis of experiences that is not conditioned, that is, made possible and qualified by the fact of belonging to a tradition. In other words, everything that Husserl kind of wanted to see as a kind of universal of human existence, how everyone in his society at his time, basically, in a certain tradition, sensed existence. How different it would be if we talked about a phenomenological investigation of, say, a tribe in Papua New Guinea or the Amazon or somewhere or other that had not had any contact with Westerners, and their experience, their phenomena means appearance in Greek, by the way. So the investigation, the logos of phenomena of appearance, but their world, their life world, would have been completely different. So Vattimo is pointing out it's always belonging to a tradition. It's not like there is an experience, and then after that we add all kinds of intellectual abstractions to it. And Vattimo goes on to write, is this not, this fact of belonging to a tradition and that colouring, shaping, limiting, etc., our phenomenological, that actually being part of the fabrication of our life world, but also of our phenomenological analysis of that life world. But is this not a situation familiar to hermeneutics, familiar to this whole branch of philosophy that deals with the interpretation of text and of existence? That one who is dominated by prejudices cannot recognize and thematize them as such. Something Nietzsche pointed out even before Husserl was writing. So the life world is something that is a life world for a certain history. And then the analysis of that life world, or for a certain historical cultural context, and then the analysis of that life world is also an analysis dependent on a historical cultural tradition, philosophical tradition, context, etc. So one of the things Husserl was famous for saying or writing was to the things themselves. In other words, let's put aside metaphysics, let's put aside this kind of positivism of science, and actually to the things that present themselves to us. When we consider the historical, cultural context and what we bring to that investigation, also to our experience itself, that his sort of rallying cry for phenomenology to the things themselves, it seems kind of naive. Once we've seen the dependence of any perceptions of things on the way of looking in the moment, which I'll come back to, and on the concepts entertained within the way of looking at any point, which I've mentioned and I'll come back to. But those concepts, the concepts that operate in us, will include scientific and other ideas for us now. Different than they would for, say, someone living exactly in the spot where I am now in England, say, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before, in medieval times, before the scientific revolution. The very way we perceive the things themselves, so-called, would not be coloured by the implicitly, kind of almost tacitly coloured, infected, shaped, and limited by a scientific worldview that we've all been educated in, and other ideas. So actually it becomes, hard to separate phenomenology from science, or rather it becomes hard to separate a phenomenological investigation from, it's infected with ideas from science. So more generally, we see that a person's experience of phenomena is hugely conditioned, shaped, determined, allowed or not, this or that sense of things, this or that experience, by the current worldview, the Weltanschauung, in the culture in which they live. But actually, even that is not quite, it's a little too simple, because it was Heidegger, or some interpretations of Heidegger, have him kind of stressing what's called a kind of historical thrownness into a zeitgeist. In other words, I am born at a certain time, in a certain place in history, I'm thrown into a kind of cultural worldview. And that's part of the problem with that needs to be realized, and this changes over time. But even that is not universal. In other words, not everyone thrown into, let's say, like I was, born in England in the 60s and then living through that and maybe living some time in the States and coming back, and is going to have the same worldview, or even the same set of influxes, strands of influxes. The history now, the strands in history are broad, so it's not universal. Even the influences operating for someone in a certain location in time and space, thrown into a certain, by their birth, into a certain location in time and space. So for Westerners living today, there is no longer, for most Westerners living today, there's no longer just one common worldview or way of experiencing the life world. So this historical thrownness, or what's called the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, is not an objective fact, a reality, what some philosophers like to call a facticity, something you can't, it's just there and you can't do anything about it. There's lots of different influxes of ideas, and we are it varies from individual to individual and subculture to subculture which are the dominant ones. how they are valued, etc. And even the whole movement of history, the victor of a war, even if it's only a cultural war, the victors write the histories. Some of you might know Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. There's a history of the United States, not that they get taught in high school, etc. History from the perspective of, say, Native Americans or African American slaves, etc. Who writes the history books? So there are many histories and many influxes of ideas given different weights and different influences in shaping, limiting, fabricating the worldview, and then the analysis in what we might call attempted phenomenological analysis of that worldview. All this needs to be taken into account. So sometimes with insight meditation, we might be tempted to assume that employing an attention or a mindfulness, or that we are employing in insight meditation and through mindfulness a kind of attention that reveals what things are, the way things are. And if we employ an attention that reveals, and I'll put that in inverted commas, reveals an atomistic world of sensation and a kind of atomistic world of experience, we might be tempted to think, oh, that's a phenomenological approach, because I'm just looking at my experience, looking at the appearances as I take them for granted, and looking carefully and investigating them carefully, and I think, oh, I don't have any presuppositions, and then what I see, it reveals, perhaps, depending on how you're applying mindfulness, and that's the key point, it reveals, say, an atomistic view, and I think, oh, so this is the phenomenological approach. When I employ the phenomenological approach, this is what I see. And then I'm corroborated by certain texts to say, yes, there are just, the self is the five aggregates, there is just this, etc., or atoms of Vedana and sensation, moment of consciousness, etc. So there's that approach in philosophy, and there's sometimes that approach within the Dharma when we think, oh, that's kind of something like the phenomenological approach. There was another German philosopher, Wilhelm Dilthey, and in some ways we could say he could be regarded even more than Husserl as the kind of grandfather of the phenomenological movement in the 20th century. And he really didn't like this kind of reductionism in psychology or philosophy, and so he was kind of scornful and pointed out that we live and move not, I'm quoting now, we live and move not in a sphere of sensations, but of objects presenting themselves to us, not in a sphere of feelings, sensations and feelings are inverted commas here, but of value, meaning, and so on. In other words, we can deconstruct appearances, but in deconstructing we also miss something. It's like looking, what's the phrase, not seeing the forest for the trees. Neither perspective, to me, so we've got on one side this kind of reductionist sensation, reducing down to atomized moments of sensation and consciousness and Vedana and whatever, and another view that's more like that's not actual experience. Actual experience involves objects, values, meanings, etc. So, to me, though, neither perspective realizes fully enough the dependence of experiences on ways of looking, nor just it doesn't realize also how broad and kind of diverse is the range of ways of looking, and therefore of experiences. So in other words, when I look a certain way, I get this experience, and it might be a atomistic a sense of appearances as atoms. When I look that way, I get a very different experiences of objects and values and meanings, etc., etc., and way broader than all that. So insisting that one or the other is the real way we experience things just misses the whole dependence on ways of looking. Conceiving of phenomenology as a kind of investigation and an uncovering of the universal human experience of a life world, or the life world, there's lots of problems with that. What I would like to stress and open is a conception of what I call the phenomenological approach, just as far as we're concerned, or what I have been calling the phenomenological approach in previous talks in the last few years, as an investigation of how experience of the life world, or how appearances, vary. So one is they vary in a historically contingent way, as Heidegger emphasized, and also depending on mood, or we could say mind state in Dharma language, but far more widely than any of that, and subtly, and the gradations are extremely subtle, depending on what I've been calling the way of looking in the moment. In the moment. So there's another philosopher, Richard Palmer, who wrote a book on hermeneutics in philosophy, and he writes about Wilhelm Dilthey's thought. Experience is precisely the reality of what is there for me before experience becomes objective, and therefore admits of a separation from the subjective. So Palmer is emphasizing this, that idea of Dilthey, that his fruitful insight, again I'm quoting, is in seeing experience as a realm before subject and object. So this is quite a common theme or emphasis or stance of some phenomenologists, saying actually experience is when we really look at our experience, there is no subject and object. That comes later. That's some kind of intellectual superimposition there. When you investigate experience, experience is just before subject and object division. Continuing, Palmer writing about Dilthey, and Dilthey's fruitful insight lay in seeing experience as a realm before subject and object, a realm in which the world and our experience of it are given together. He saw with clarity the poverty of the subject-object model of human encounter with the world. I personally have problems with this, and if you've done enough practice in some of the ways that I've suggested, you would have problems with it as well. You should have problems with it as well, because the sense of subject-object split that I or you experience, the sense of them being split, there is a subject and there is an object. They're somehow loosely connected, but they're really split, or them as being kind of poles of a polarity, or the dissolution of that polarity in some kind of oneness or unity or whatever, varies in experience dependent on the way of looking. The very sense and experience of subject and object and their relationship, or what they are in relationship to each other, varies dependent on the way of looking. So, there is a poverty, as Palmer points out, to the subject-object model of human encounter with the world. But it's not because the reality of our basic experience is devoid of the subject-object split. A model that insists that experience is always pre-reflectively devoid of, or pre-reflective experience is always devoid of, or before subject and object, is equally poor. This is how it is, and then we add something, the idea of subject and object based on all kinds of intellectual ideas or whatever. That's equally poor. So to insist on the reality of subject-object split, either implicitly or explicitly, is as poor as a model as it is to insist that always there is no subject-object split. It's only added to or split later by the intellect or whatever. The sense of subject and object, and I mean the pre-reflective, I'm not talking about intellective, the sense of it depends on the way of looking in the moment for its intensity, its vividness, and the degree of its separation. So just how much of a duality or polarity or oneness or total alienation or whatever between subject and object depends on the way of looking in the moment. Depends, and a meditator will see that very, very clearly. What's more, the state or the perception of the subject-object polarity in our experience is affected by the very investigation of it. So in investigating, in giving it careful attention, in paying attention to it with curiosity, let's see, where's that subject-object split now? As I pay attention to it, that paying attention to it is itself a way of looking, and it changes. The attentive curiosity to the state of the subject-object sort of nexus or gestalt or whatever we're going to call it, that paying attention to it curiously affects the state of it, and therefore the perception of it. Just like, as Heisenberg pointed out, with the observation of matter. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and what's fundamental sort of tenet of quantum mechanics, dependent on the way of looking. Even just trying to, being interested in the subject-object split, try it. What's common to a lot of these endeavors is just, I think, maybe just a human tendency. Maybe it's part of what the Buddha called basic avijja. This kind of need or want to say, this is how it is. This is how it is. So dilthey says this about subject-object, and someone else says that, or whatever, if that's what we're talking about. This is how it is. And this is how it is means this is how it is, again, independent of the way of looking. So, historical context is a conditioning factor in what appears to us in our sense of the appearance of the life world. That historical context is not even a universal for anyone alive today, for everyone alive today. And even more than all that, dependence on ways of looking. Dependence on ways of looking. Ways of looking can be deliberate, consciously played with, manipulated, experimented with, but they operate anyway. There's always a way of looking. When there's any experience, when there's any appearance, when there's any life world at all, when there's any perception, there's a way of looking. And that way of looking includes concepts even if we're not conscious of them at the time, what they are. They're implicit, they're tacit, they're very, very subtle. So, I mean, I've gone on and on about that, so you know that by now. But in what I call for our work, when I refer to the phenomenological approach, it's really the investigation of how do different ways of looking affect or fabricate appearances differently. How does the world, inner and outer, how does experience, appearance, perception get constructed, built, experienced differently dependent on the way of looking in the moment? What's involved in that? What's the possibility there? Is there some stance that is not, or some perception, some appearance that we can then say it's not dependent on the way of looking? Find out. But the phenomenological approach, when I borrow that word from philosophy, I really mean that. The investigation of how different ways of looking fabricate differently. So in that context, bare attention or mindfulness, these are ways of looking. They're not revealing a reality, any kind of objective reality. They're ways of looking. And what we see with any kind of mindfulness, bare attention, or this or that, is what we then experience, sense through that particular lens at that time. And involved in that are concepts, and involved in that is metaphysics. I really want to insist on this. So what do I mean by metaphysics? Actually, it's a big, problematic and contentious word, metaphysics. I'm going to say, and I've said I think a little before, but I'm going to say that it includes ontological beliefs and assumptions, epistemological beliefs and assumptions. In other words, beliefs and assumptions about what's real and about how we know, or what constitutes valid knowledge to be respected concerning what is real or not real, etc. And also a whole cosmology. What is the nature of this world, etc., and of a human being? So metaphysics is really any time there's any belief, assumption, I would say conscious or unconscious, implicit or explicit, around ontology, epistemology, cosmology. And these are not just abstract, they're commitments we have. So they shape what we value, how we practice, what we intend, how we invest our energy, what we devote ourselves to, but also how we move in the world. And how we talk to each other. All they involve ontological and epistemological, cosmological commitments, beliefs and assumptions, wrapped up in perception, any and all perception. That's one aspect of metaphysics. I mean, all that's quite broad sweep there. But also metaphysics has come to be very contentious as the kind of speculation about anything that's behind appearances. So if you talk about gods or souls or any kind of mysterious energy or something like that, this is regarded and dismissed because it's metaphysics, and modern people are not interested in metaphysics. So the sort of thrust goes. But as we pointed out when we talked about science, even fundamental particles are something behind appearances. They're not immediately discernible to the senses, and they're not even discernible with high-powered. An electron microscope still can't see an electron, or let alone a quark or whatever. Assuming that there is a reality behind our everyday appearances of this, the atomistic reality of atoms of matter or atoms of sensation and consciousness, etc., assuming that's the reality behind appearances, that's too also a metaphysics. And as I said, even physical laws are something, so to speak, behind appearances. Can be extremely abstract. We might say, but scientific laws are at least amenable to empirical checking through experiment and whatever, and we can kind of hone in on the truth there. Not so simple. that distinction. Spiritual laws, if we can even use such a term, psychological laws are also soul laws, if we can use those kind of ideas, are also kind of testable and can predict what happens. But anyway, there's metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, cosmology. There's metaphysics as the postulation of what is behind appearances as a reality. And then there's also and I want to draw this out, it's kind of wrapped up in those other two definitions or aspects of metaphysics. But there's also what I would call the metaphysics of objectivity. And that is the assumption of a singular objective reality that it's possible for us to know. This is how things are. So that metaphysics of objectivity, it's all over the place. All over the place. Even when people say, I don't believe in truth, or the Buddha wasn't interested in truth, or this or that, it's hiding in one's approach to often in people's approach to existence, etc. There's a metaphysics of objectivity, an assumption of a singular objective reality that's possible for us to know. And that actually is an ontological, epistemological belief, assumption, or commitment, as I said in the first aspect. But these metaphysical concepts and ideas are wrapped up in perception. They walk around with us and they shape things for us. So, sometimes it's possible to just get rid of metaphysics, dispense with it, put it aside, cut it out. And that's kind of, often the sort of rallying cry of people who have some people who have more of an existentialist bent. But, I'd say we can truly avoid or dispense with metaphysics about as successfully or to the extent that we can truly avoid or dispense with experiences in the six sense spheres. In other words, where there is sensing, where there is sensation, there is metaphysics. There is ontological beliefs, assumptions about what's real, about what experiences we can trust, about what constitutes knowing something, all of this and more. And also the sense of something being, so to speak, behind, that we don't have direct experience of, but we can trust, and it's part of reality. So, people say, I'll cut out the metaphysics, throw it away, etc. Great. You can do that about as easily as you can get rid of all of your sense experiences in the five sense spheres and the mind of thought and imagining. So it's important to point out, you can't just pretend that we don't have ontological, epistemological, cosmological commitments. Meaning that's actually where we, as I said, we invest our energy, our time, our dedication, etc. And also what we trust, what we rely on, and what we value. One of the even more interesting things about all this is that epistemology, I said, is the kind of ideas about, or beliefs about, or exploration about what knowledge can we trust concerning, let's say, what is real. But when you really probe and ask questions epistemologically, you will inevitably come to some kind of answer that you realize it rests on some kind of other assumption, and that assumption, whatever it is actually ultimately unprovable. In other words, you're going to come, if you really probe, well, I think this is real. How do I know? Well, because I value this kind of way of gaining knowledge and that kind of way of gaining knowledge. I don't value that one and that one. And so why do you value that? And then you keep asking, why? You'll come down to some kind of assumption that you then can't prove. Okay, And this is a really important thing to acknowledge. So as I said, a lot of this ontology epistemology operates wordlessly and unconsciously as logoi in the perceiving consciousness, so to speak. Any moment of mindfulness has some metaphysics with it, and you can see again if you've done a lot of like more intense mindfulness practice, you will see how, for instance, the sense of materiality varies. Once there's a lot of momentum to the mindfulness and close mindfulness, the solidity of things, of materiality, actually starts to unsolidify. And so the separation between mind and matter begins to, the subject-object split between mind and matter also begins to kind of loosen or melt a little bit. Depending on how much and what kind of mindfulness one is applying. And then if that melts a little bit, this dichotomy between mind and matter and also between subject and object, if that melts just a little bit, that polarity eases, the sort of the split between the two poles of mind and matter or subject and object kind of eases, melts a little bit together. Then at that point, the mindfulness has different ontology and epistemology, etc. If one's really going with it and into it, than it did when it started. But even with just the instructions of mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta, the kind of experience that opens up in different, applying different of the mindfulness instructions in the Satipatthana Sutta will also bring with it, or carries with it, and then unfolds different ontologies, epistemologies, etc. So mindfulness is actually, it's not one way of looking, it's many ways of looking. You know, imagining your corpse disintegrating, falling apart in a charnel ground is one of the instructions in the Satipatthana Sutta, in the Sutta of Mindfulness, the discourse of Buddha's discourse of mindfulness. That's a certain way of looking. The experience of sitting in a very calm state and contemplating the mind states, or contemplating the feeding and starving, the presence and absence of the 7 factors of awakening or something. This is a very different way of looking. And then, so any moment of mindfulness carries with it certain set of metaphysical assumptions, certain metaphysics, and our lives are lived and experienced with, or from, if you like, whatever is our habitual set of metaphysical ideas, beliefs, concepts. Heidegger wrote metaphysics is not something which can be put aside like an opinion, nor can it be left behind us like a doctrine in which we no longer believe. So this whole idea of putting aside metaphysics, cutting it out, just not engaging in it, when you actually understand what's involved there, you realize actually we can't do that, we carry it with us. And what we can do is explore different metaphysics, or see what metaphysical concepts, how they affect, what different metaphysical concepts how they have different effects on our experience. So there was this phenomenological current in Western philosophy from a whole other direction. Is what's called, it's not such a big deal, but a whole other different direction in philosophy. Then we have someone like Richard Rorty, who died not too long ago, an American philosopher. And he was quite influential for some people, and he wrote. He's talking about two other philosophers now, Wilfrid Sellars and W.V.O. Quine, and they're what's called like analytical philosophers. So they're very it's a very different kind of philosophy than what we just talked about with those Husserl and Dilthey and people like that, dilthey and people like that. And so this kind of analysis of human thought, analysis of theory, analysis of what are the elements of reality and how we can form scientific opinions about things. So that kind of philosophy. And Rorty investigated all this and kind of came in that tradition, for the most part at least. And then he said, I interpret Sellars' attack on givenness. So this Wilfrid Sellars had talked about, we have this idea of what is given to us by experience, like a basic kind of, this is the basic givenness. Life gives us this or that appearance, and then we do X or Y with it. But there's a basic givenness. Wilfrid Sellars actually just kind of demolished that idea. And then Quine, again, an analytical philosopher and famous for concluding after his investigations, all so-called raw data are already theory-laden. So similar to Wilfrid Sellars' attack on givenness, and similar you'll hear to what we've been harping on and on about emptiness and ways of looking. All so-called raw data. Let's just get to the basic fact, and not add anything more to that. A very attractive idea to many people, but after all his very scrupulous logical and philosophical investigations, Quine just concluded all so-called raw data are already theory-laden, which is just what I've been saying. We're already bringing concept in the ways that we look at experience. There is no raw data that we can have. There is no givenness. So Rorty is saying, I interpret Sellars' attack on givenness and Quine's attack on necessity as the crucial steps in undermining the possibility of a theory of knowledge, in other words, epistemology. The holism and pragmatism common to both philosophers, and which they share with others, are the lines of thought that, when extended in a certain way, let us see truth as, in William James's phrase, what is better for us to believe rather than as the accurate representation of reality. What is better for us to believe? And that's a very dharmic, at least as I would present the emptiness teachings. What is better for us to, or how is it better for us to look? That's slightly different. What is better for us to believe rather than as, quote, the accurate representation of reality, which is usually how we think about truth, or that's possible to look in meditation in a certain way and see this is how it is. This is the accurate representation, either because I'm super equanimous and very calm, unruffled, unemotional, or mindful, or whatever it is. And then he says, or to put the point less provocatively, I think this is more provocative, but anyway, they show us that the notion of accurate representation is simply an automatic or empty compliment which we pay to those beliefs which are successful in helping us do what we want to do. In other words, we kind of call real just what we want to. It's convenient to call something real depending on what we want to do with a certain point of view or a certain assumption about reality. So it's a little unclear from that quote there what he means by what we want to do. He might mean whether we want to kind of apply technology, or whether we want to build up a relationship with someone, or whatever it is. But there's a quote from Nietzsche which I actually can't find, and again, Nietzsche so much at this kind of forerunner with so much thinking, so much philosophy, but he said something like, people select their philosophy about reality, etc., based on, I'm paraphrasing now in our language, based on what kind of freedom their soul wants. In other words, if they want to set something free in themselves that they really care about, set their soul free in relation to that, then they adopt a philosophy and therefore a whole worldview and sense of existence and real and unreal and all that, dependent on just what the soul wants. What do we want to do? So when we're practicing mindfulness, mindfulness is also wanting something. Mindfulness wants something. It's set in and it's determined by a context of desiring that is shaped by the Four Noble Truths. What do I want when I'm mindful? I want liberation. I want ease of dukkha. I want to move towards the Third Noble Truth. What's that? Well, I have to understand the First Noble Truth. Mindfulness is also set in the context of the Fourth Noble Truth, the Eightfold Path, all of that. And a certain understanding of what gives rise to dukkha in the Second Noble Truth. So it's set in a conceptual context, but it's also wanting something. There's a desire there. What we want to do, says Rorty. What do we want to do? What do we want to do? So letting that question actually shape our ideas of what truth is and reality, what we say, what we might loosely now term truth or reality, depending on what we want to do. What do we want to do? I mean, collectively, this is interesting because it's like our collective global crises now, and the crisis of the species and the earth and the climate and etc. Do we want to? What do we want to do? We want to solve those crises, I hope. If we want to solve the crises by purely technological thought, technological thinking, technological perceptions, it's purely an issue about carbon dioxide levels, and if we can get some technology to kind of remove the carbon dioxide, great, really important. Is that the limit of what we want to do? Solve our crises by those kinds of ways of looking, those kinds of value systems, ontologies, all that. Nature as machine and commodity might have been part of how we got into this mess in the first place. What do we want to do? And in caring for people, what does that mean to care for people? What do we want to do? What is a human being? What is a person? So are we caring by giving so much attention to the GDP and kind of relentlessly being entrenched in the view of growth economics? What do we want to do, and what's the relationship between what we want to do and our views of what's real and what is the case, what a human being is, what nature is, what the world is? And what do we want to do together as a society, and what do we want to do as individuals? Because individuals, we have very different directions of our desire, of our longing, of our aspirations. One of Richard Rorty's main concerns was actually social, and he was famous for saying something, I can't remember the exact quote, but his basic intention, or the point of all his philosophy, was just to keep the conversation going. In other words, he wanted this idea of non-truth to his statement about why it was important was so that we can keep talking to each other, so that there is this kind of conversation that's possible to ongo between different points of view, etc. I don't know all his writings, but I read some. What seems strange to me is that he kept saying this thing about the basic point of all this is to keep the conversation going, There's a social concern there, but I'm not aware of him actually engaging in much conversation about different points of view in a way that was really productive or changed anyone's mind or brought anyone into at least being able to experience someone else's worldview and what opened from that. Is the conversation ongoing? I'm not sure in our wider culture. Did he take part in that? I'm not sure. And if so, how much power and significance? Because if it's just a intellectual conversation, it actually, doesn't enable one, as I said, to really open up the sense of existence and the worldview. The playing with ways of looking, the flexibility with ways of looking, that's what I call meditation, and that actually allows an altering of view, meaning experience, meaning appearance. This idea that Rorty actually at least said that he felt was important to keep the conversation going. It as a model of that, or an example of that kind of social opening up and social cohesion and openness of conversation and openness of the kind of relationship with truth. As a model, there is the midrashic tradition in the Jewish tradition. Midrash is a kind of commentary or interpretation of the whole set of sacred scriptures. So now I'm paraphrasing another philosopher called Gerald Bruns, who writes about hermeneutics, but in this chapter he's writing about the midrash. And he's talking about people go to study, and in the Beit Midrash, in the house where this kind of hermeneutics of the Bible is studied, and there's this fierce debates going on, but fierce as they are, and kind of polarized as they are in terms of the difference of opinions, they don't split the community. So there's polarly opposite opinions on the interpretation of this passage or that passage. This rabbi says this, the other rabbi says completely opposite. And a student, he says, how am I supposed to study in such an environment? What is this? It's chaos, this chaos of opinions and contradictory viewpoints. One guy says this, the other guy says the opposite, a third guy says a third thing. What am I supposed to do with that? And the idea is that is exactly the perfect environment for studying, relating to, opening up and being opened up by the sacred text. And I would like to, as I said right at the beginning of this talk, to remind us that hermeneutics means the interpretation not just of texts, but also of existence. So here's a social situation that took place, that was ongoing for hundreds and hundreds of years in Judaism. I'm not sure if it's still going, but of kind of openness to different points of view. Multiple interpretations were viable. An infinity of interpretations was conceivable, and there was this great fecundity of different viewpoints, different chewings over, different reworkings, different connections made of regarding any passage from any sacred text, but then regarding the whole thing also. So that in this social context, those engaged in relating to, in this case, the Torah or other texts this way, see that they, I'm quoting Bruns now, we see that they imagine themselves as part of the whole, participating in Torah. Torah is the Old Testament in Hebrew. Participating in Torah rather than operating on it at an analytical distance, participating in it. So it's not something that I look at from a cold distance. I'm actually somehow part of it in my engagement with it, in this whole tussle and multiplicity of opinions and interpretations and slants and elaborations and connections. That actually is part of it. I'm participating in it. We are participating in it. This conversation is participating in it. This social scene is part of it. Participation. From that idea of participation, it follows that the words of interpretation cannot be isolated in any rigorously analytical way from the words of Torah itself. In other words, where does the Old Testament end and the interpretation of it begin? It's all of it is Torah. It's all this whole. The subject and the object, the way of looking and what appears, the concept brought to bear, and the world that opens up there. It's all Torah. You cannot separate. You cannot separate the text. You cannot separate existence. If we elaborate what's said here in terms of text, we elaborate that, extend it to include existence. You get this? Again, Burns. In other words, the Torah is constituted as an open canon. To be sure, the letters of the original scriptures are fixed, but they are not dead. So there's something alive here. Openness here has to be construed as the openness of what is written. That is, its applicability to the time of its interpretation, its need for actualization. So we'll come back to that point shortly. So you must picture the text not as a formal object, so many fixed letters, but as an open canon again, whose boundaries are shaped and reshaped by the give and take of midrashic argument. So here's this whole community of passionate debate and creativity and probing and wider study and elaboration and contextualization, and that is something that shapes the boundaries of the in this case the scripture, the text, and we could also again say about existence. So those who study in this way, with this passion and with this knowledge and with this elaboration, they make the text what it is, and they make it above all open. They open it to the present and the future. The Torah, the text, or existence, emerges as what it is and comes into its own only in the dialogue it generates. And only by entering into the dialogue can one enter the Torah, enter the text. Now, this is a social situation I'll come back to, but we can also just translate this to our own individual, if we can even create an individual isolated. We're always influenced by ideas that we get from the past and our contemporaries as much as what emerges for ourselves. But there's this dialogue, this flexibility of interpretations, of elaborations, of contextualizations, and the multiplicity of interpretations there. So this would be an example socially of the kind of thing that Rorty at least claimed that he was interested in. But it's more than what Rorty was getting at. Is a different notion because of this idea of participation. There are those who study, who passionately engage with the in this case the text, or reality, or the sense of existence, or whatever it is. They're participating. They see themselves as not separate. It's not something that we have this kind of objective stance with in the kind of scientific epistemology. Participating in the text and participating in the holiness. Yeah. So this whole view, very different than rorty. It's a view of a social situation, of a conversation that keeps going, of an openness in regard to notions of truth, etc. But it preserves holiness. And I think, in terms of Richard Rorty, and he's quite an influential and popular in some circles philosopher, I really get the sense reading him that he had a hidden agenda and a hidden kind of dogmatism of physicalism. So he often kind of, despite all this talk about open truth, he often kind of lets slip statements or passages that just sound like his basic view is a view of atomic, meaningless movement of meaningless material particles in a meaningless universe, and that was a kind of bedrock that he couldn't shake, a hidden dogmatism there for himself that also spread through his writings, and a kind of hidden agenda that was, if you like, favouring that view, that metaphysics, that ontology and epistemology, etc., over and against any kind of religious or spiritual view or something else. But again, so this midrashic example, this example of midrashic debate and the passion and the give and take and the complexity and the variability and the wideness and the multiplicity of that, was an example of something that was actually creative. I'm not sure if it's still ongoing or if it sort of came to a halt at some point in perhaps a few hundred years ago. I'm not sure, but it actually was a creative, ongoing debate that worked its way into people's psyches and then into their actual views and how they lived their life. In other words, it was a conversation, actual conversation, that actually did affect perception, senses of existence, commitments, practices, devotions, orientations, all of that. Let me quote from a rabbi called Rabbi Ephraim of Sudilkov, because he points out also, we're talking about hermeneutics now, the interpretation of usually sacred text, but as I said, I want to expand that to the interpretation of existence. So the interpretation of texts, of teachings, but also of existence. And using this model of kind of what's quite alive and insisted on in the Jewish tradition, this kind of multiplicity, etc., and this non-singleness and non-objective status of the truth. So the truth as something multiple, amenable to multi-perspectives, infinitely variegated, infinitely mineable, infinitely fertile, and dependent on our participation, dependent on all kinds of things. So he writes, this Rabbi Ephraim writes, until they, and he means the people who are engaged wholeheartedly, passionately, with integrity, with commitment to this interpretation of sacred text, of Torah, until they had interpreted, the Torah was not considered complete, but only half finished. Again, it's not a thing existing by itself. It depends on my participation. Same. The point I'm trying to. The wider point is same with existence. Same with Dharma. It was until they had interpreted it, the sacred text was not considered complete, but only half finished. It was the rabbis, through their interpretation, who made the Torah whole. And then he continues to say. He continues. Such is the case for each generation. And its leaders or explorers in this case, they complete the Torah, they complete the text. The Torah is interpreted in each generation according to that generation's needs. nowadays we say the needs are diverse. That's part of what some people call the postmodern condition. We have different perspectives and different needs, but the point here is, again, this non-fixity of the truth, the amenability to different situations, which are also different interpretations, which are also historically contextualized. The Torah is interpreted in each generation according to that generation's needs, which we might add now today are multiple, varied, and according to the soul root of those who live at that time. That may be an idea we come back to. God thus enlightens the sages of the generation in the interpretation of his holy Torah. He who denies this is as one who denies the Torah itself. God forbid. So you could read that as a kind of attempt at consolidating rabbinic authority, but actually it opened up. It was part of a movement that kept open and insisted on keeping open this multiplicity of interpretation, and kept open the not just the possibility, but the fact of that interpretations evolving and changing over time, dependent on the historical cultural context. Isaiah Berlin, some of you will have heard about him, another philosopher kind of person. And he wrote a fair amount on a guy called Giambattista Vico, who was an Italian philosopher who lived in the 17th and 18th centuries. And Vico wrote about history, and he had quite different ideas, quite revolutionary ideas for his time on history and culture and worldview and all that. And so this is a passage from Isaiah Berlin writing about Vico around all this. Vico's importance in the history of the Western Enlightenment consists in his insistence on the plurality of cultures and on the consequently fallacious character, the mistaken character of the idea that there is one and only one structure of reality which the enlightened philosopher can see as it truly is, and which he can, at least in principle, describe in logically perfect language. A vision that has obsessed all kinds of thinkers. And then he names a bunch of philosophers. So there again, the notion of a singular objective reality that's universally true for all people, all times, all cultures, and all situations. And how endemic that assumption is, whether or not you're a philosopher, or you consider yourself a philosopher or an intellectual or any of that. It creeps into our Dharma practice, it creeps into our everyday discourse, it creeps into all kinds of things. For Vico, this is Berlin continuing, for Vico, humanity asks different questions of the universe, and their answers are shaped accordingly. Such questions, and the symbols or acts that express them, alter or become obsolete in the course of cultural development, in the course of history. To understand the answers, one must understand the questions that preoccupy an age or a culture. They are not constant, nor necessarily more profound, because they resemble our own more than others that are less familiar to us. And then he bemoans the fact that Giambattista Vico was a philosopher that very few people actually bother to read. Different questions. We're back to this question I posed earlier. What do we want? In Rorty, we were left hanging with his quote, "What we want," and Nietzsche's quote that I couldn't remember about we actually have different questions that we bring, and we want different answers, or we choose different answers depending on what we want, depending on the worldview that we want to support, because it supports something in our soul. Different questions, and those questions have to. In other words, when we talk about hermeneutics, when we talk about all this in relation to practice, so I emphasize the passion and the involvement of the midrashic context and that kind of heated debate and the endless sort of creativity and soulful investigation and probing and teasing out and elaboration on text. It matters. So for all this, what I'm saying to make sense, it makes sense in the context of it being passionately important. Something in us is important to us. It probably would not be the case, but if someone was just listening to this and they just weren't interested in opening up a sense of existence or what truth was or any of that, none of this would, it would be completely ridiculous to be hearing it and just sound like a bunch of words that's kind of maybe perhaps mildly interesting or something. Mattering matters. When we talk about hermeneutics, when we talk about the sense of existence, what we're bringing to it, and how we can see or sense existence, and how we can legitimate this or that, it matters that it matters to us. So when we talk about the way we sense existence, and when we want to open up those possibilities, we're talking about something that some level of our soul, its passion is connected. And again, Gerald Bruns points out that an interpretation, in whether it's of sacred text or whatever, it has to matter. So you can't have a good interpretation by anyone of anything when that thing, text or sense of existence, doesn't really matter to them. So this is quoting Gerald Bruns. Say that interpretation, hermeneutics, is an act performed by a person to whom things matter, not by a consciousness primed to produce pictures of how things are in the world, or in the text, or in whatever state of affairs is put before it in analysis. It's different than the picture of cold scientific epistemology that we talked about. Absence of emotion. The Torah, he continues, is a text that makes things matter. It preserves the smallest details of life from inconsequence and triviality. If you know the Torah, there's like hundreds of pages about every little minute detail of life, and bringing all that into the realm of mattering passionately, and bringing all that into the possibility of being made holy, being sacralized, being sanctified. Again, Bruns, mattering at all events is what the midrashic text, I have been quoting where he was talking about a certain passage that was actually that student complaining about there were so many different opinions there, and how can he possibly study and understand what the Torah is when there's all these people with completely different opinions. Explaining in the house of study in the Beit Midrash there. Mattering at all events is what the midrashic text I have been quoting from presupposes with respect to interpretation. Midrash is not a formal operation, but a form of life lived with a text that makes claims on people. A text that makes claims upon people turns them into respondents. They are answerable to the text in a way that is qualitatively different from the answerability of disengaged observers to the scenes they wish to depict. Now we could substitute the word existence for text and talk about what we are talking about now, this whole exploration of ontology, epistemology, conceptuality, and opening up sensing with soul. So this whole probing of ideas and the possibilities in sensing with soul is not a formal operation, but a form of life lived with an existence or perceptions of existence that make claims on people. That kind of sense of existence makes claims on people, turns them into respondents. They are answerable. We are answerable to existence in a way that's different from someone who's just coldly, aloofly, analytically describing it. So we're talking, again, notice there, desire eros, this longing to understand, this passion connected with connected with what I want to open up and how I perceive existence and what is legitimized or not, and what senses are valued or not. There's passion and there's desire and there's eros in that investigation, in that debate that we're talking about. There's emotion there. So desire, eros, and emotion are, because they're necessary for the kind of hermeneutics that we're talking about and the kind of debate about hermeneutics that we're talking about, they are necessary, they are included in the epistemology. We're not talking about now I'm in a neutral mind state, now I don't want anything, therefore I see clearly. Now there's the quietening of emotion and a calm, equanimous mindfulness, therefore I trust what I see. Nor the kind of scientific epistemology that I pointed out devalues or tries to put aside emotion or any kind of wish. Theoretically pushes that aside. It doesn't really. Desire, eros, emotion, necessary and included in the kind of epistemology that we're involved with and trying to open up, and in the whole debate around that. So it needs to matter. You wouldn't be listening, I presume, at this point if none of this mattered to you. It needs to matter. It needs to matter passionately. We need to be involved, engaged. Our lives are on the line. Our sense of existence is on the line. It needs to matter for us, and it matters also in what comes out of it. It matters because, as some guy called Moscovici wrote and pointed out, questions of epistemology are also questions of social order. Questions of epistemology are also questions of social order. We might say pecking order. So I've talked in the past about epistemicide, epistemic cleansing, epistemic colonialism, etc. In other words, the dominant worldview of secular modernism taking over other cultures and disregarding, devaluing, dismissing, putting aside, sometimes even outlawing their worldview, their ontology, their cosmology, their epistemology. Questions of epistemology are also questions of social order, the questions of hierarchy and pecking order within a culture. Whose voices get ridiculed, whose voices just become the entrenched, dominant, unquestioned, accepted view of what reality is, and therefore policy, political, economic, governmental, social, environmental policy is based on certain worldviews which are based on certain epistemologies. Certain cosmologies are based on certain epistemologies. So this needs to matter to us, and it matters in the world. And then again, does the victor, the cultural victor, or the epistemology that is a cultural victor, become at some point a prisoner of that very epistemology, of the very rigidifications and entrenchments of whatever epistemology one is in, as a victor, then becomes the prisoner?
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed,